Hello and welcome to another Tattered Cover live event. If you don't know, Tattered Cover is an independent bookstore located in Denver, but you can shop on our website, tatteredcover.com, anywhere in the United States, and buy your books there. If you'd like to access closed captioning for tonight, that'll be the bottom right of your screen. And tonight we have Carol Dines. Carol Dines writes novels and short stories for adults and young adults. Her latest YA novel, The Takeover Friend, will be published by Fitzroy Books in October 2022. She's also written 2 additional YA novels, Best Friends Tell the Best Lies and The Queen's Soprano, as well as a collection of YA short stories, Talk to Me. Her collection of short stories for adults, This Distance We Call Love, was published by Orison Books in 2021. We also have Amy Hartl. Amy Hartl is a psychologist who did her PhD research on the adolescent social world, specifically how and why teen friendships so often end. Her research examined the dynamics of teen friendship, romantic relationships, and the peer network. One of her studies was monumental in examining why most teen friendships end and is used in research to understand how contemporary school culture and social media impact teen friendship. Please welcome Carol Dines and Amy Hartl.
There we go. Thank you all for being here. It really means a lot to me to celebrate my book. And thank you, Tattered Cover, for hosting this event. It's a wonderful bookstore. There are people here from all over the United States. And just in case you don't know, Tattered Cover is really a jewel of a bookstore. I also want to thank Amy for being here. As I was researching my novel, and I began looking at articles about teen friendship and toxic friendship and friendships that end, and almost all of the articles sourced Amy's work. So I sent her a note and she is generously joining us tonight. I'm here tonight to talk about, so the way I'm going, or the overview of tonight, I'm going to present the book and I'm going to do an overview, read a very short section, and then we're going to get right into discussion. And then we're going to save time at the end for your questions. I began thinking about this book when I was in my late 40s. I had gone through a very painful breakup with one of my closest friends. And at the same time, my daughter was going through a painful breakup of her own with her best childhood friend. I began to think about why friendships become so complicated and why we don't talk more about how and why friendships end. As I began writing this book, I talked to people and I was surprised to find that almost everyone had a story of having to break up a friendship because it had begun to feel unhealthy. And I also began to talk to parents and have been really moved by the concern many parents feel for their children not being able to meet good friends or have friendships, or being worried about the friendships that some of their children get into, their teens. So this book, that was I thought all of this would be fertile ground for a YA novel. And my book is about Sonia and Francis, and they meet the second day of high school. Francis Sonia's just moved from Paris. She is moving with her mother. Her parents are going through a very bitter divorce, and she's an only child. Francis comes from a very different kind of family. She's the youngest of 3. Her sister's at Oberlin. Her brother is a soccer star, a senior at her high school. Her mom's a high school counselor, and her father is a musician and the stay-at-home parent. When they meet, Frances immediately feels mesmerized by Sonia's worldliness, her brilliance, her humor. And Sonia loves Frances's laid back vibe and her creativity. And when she meets Frances's family, she finds the family she wishes she had. And the book goes on to really show the evolution of the friendship from the initial euphoria of having met each other to their developing a very intense, all-consuming friendship as Sonia spends more and more time with Frances's family, partly to escape the loneliness of her own family. When Sonia's mother goes through a crisis, Frances's family reaches out and tells Sonia to stay with them. And at that point, Sonia begins a relationship with Frances's brother. And that's really the turning point, because Frances really begins to feel that Sonia, with her big personality and her family's big problems, she's starting to take over her life. And she begins to feel a need to find her own voice and draw healthy boundaries in the friendship. And that is really when the problems start. It throws it off balance when Frances develops her own voice and needs in the friendship. I'm going to read tonight a short section, and then we'll move into, I'm very excited to have a discussion. And the part that I'm going to read tonight is one of their first arguments, and it really kind of brings out their different styles of communication. They've just come back from a party at one of Frances's best friends, Josh, and Sonia wanted to leave much earlier, and Frances wanted to stay. They're now at Frances's house. Sonia spends every weekend at Frances's house, and Frances narrates the book. As we lay there in the dark, I could hear Sonia breathing loudly. Can I just say one thing? She turned to face me. Tonight at the party, you didn't care if I froze or felt out of place. And you know what really gets me? We had a plan for me to sleep over, and you were just willing to cancel so you could stay and flirt with Josh, even though you don't really want Josh. You just don't want anyone else to have him either. Maybe it's the same with me. You want a best friend, but you don't want to work at being a best friend. I lay completely still. Her words felt a little bit true, but not entirely true. I was not a person who knew immediately what I felt, and I needed to sort my feelings, like lights and darks in the laundry basket. I was making piles in my mind, Sonia's perspective and my perspective. Even now, she said, I have no idea what you're thinking. I'm thinking about what you just said, I told her. Sonia sat up, her foot pressing into my hip. Can I be honest? You always try to be so nice, but really you hide behind nice. You're actually very passive aggressive. Sweet Frances Tannen, easy one. Underneath, control freak. I was so stung by her words, I couldn't think of anything to say. Besides, I wasn't sure what passive aggressive meant. See, you control by going silent, she said. I couldn't listen to her anymore. I was sick of everyone, sick of Josh's insincere wish to be my boyfriend, sick of Sonia's words, sick of my brother's put-me-downs and my know-it-all sister's advice, sick of my mother's post-it notes and my father's mood shifts, sick of the tension in our house. Mostly, I was sick of my life. I felt everyone took a piece of me, and there was nothing left over for myself. Fine, Sonia pulled out her cell. I'll go home then. I listened as she called her mother to come pick her up. I'm not feeling well, she said. No, I can't stay here. Then she gathered her things into her backpack and left. I was relieved when the door shut behind her. I needed time to think. 5 minutes later, I heard a tap at my window. I looked out to see Sonia lobbing her mittens against the glass. She'd pulled on her boots and wore a hooded jacket over her pajamas. I went downstairs and opened the back door. She stood crying in the fresh snow. I had never seen Sonia cry. She lost her beauty when she cried. Her face pinched around her nose and her eyes swelled. I glanced at the empty street. Isn't your mom coming? She shook her head. My mother would never come pick me up at this hour. She's passed out in bed. Her eyelashes glistened from tears. I faked the call. We stood outside, the ground covered in a layer of white. It was so quiet, winter quiet. I could hear both of us breathe, little puffs of hot air coming out of our mouths. I glanced at the moon and stars. I couldn't tell if the brightest star was a satellite or real. Light years away if it was a real star. I always felt a little lost when I thought about time that way, a different kind of lost. Excuse me. When I thought about time that way, a different kind of lost, as if nothing at this moment in time really mattered in the context of star time. And in some strange way, that was the great leveler, distances that made loneliness seem irrelevant. I felt a little freer. I moved back inside and nodded for Sonia to come too. When we climbed into bed, she whispered, I didn't think you'd let me leave. I said, I thought you wanted to leave. You are very pretty when you're angry, she told me. You should get very angry at Gravy. Gravy's Francis's crush. I didn't laugh. I didn't want her turning my feelings into a joke. I wanted her to hear me, my words and my silences. Are we okay? She reached over and patted my arm. We got through our first tiff. I smiled at the word tiff. So a little bit about how they communicate differently. Frances is an introvert. She's a little shyer and more thoughtful. And Sonia's just out there. She is out there about her family. She's out there about her problems. And so, Amy, I'm going to move it to you now. I want to ask you, Sonia and Frances are so happy to have found each other that Frances kind of overlooks the warning signs in their friendship. From your research, can you tell us what why teens need and want such close friendships, and why friendship is so important for teen well-being?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So teen friendships offer a variety of benefits. During the highs of adolescence, teen friendships provide joy, adventure, and imagination. And that's a lot of what we see in your novel. During the lows, they provide more of a social safety net and emotional support. So when they're going through different struggles, they have someone to turn to. And even just one friendship can help adolescents avoid those feelings of loneliness or isolation. Now, friendships in adolescence are very different from the friendships when you're a child, because when you're a child, they're mostly based off of proximity. They might be more like playmates. You'll be friends with the neighborhood kids or friends with your parents' friends' kids. But in adolescence, you have a lot more opportunity. You get a lot more choice. And adolescence is not a time where you have a lot of choice. You don't get to choose which schools you go to, which teachers you have, which classes you take, sometimes not even what you eat at night, but you do get to choose your friends. And so this is a moment where they have control, they have freedom, and they test boundaries. We start exploring friendships that are maybe outside of our comfort zone. We start making relationships with people who have different interests than us. So it's a moment not just for freedom and control and having a say in who's in your life, but also seeing different things, getting a different perspective, going beyond your comfort zone. So all of those come through the friendships of adolescence.
Mm-hmm. So one of the shocking things in your research were the statistics about why friendships so many friendships end for teens. And in my book, Sonia and Frances break up a few times, even before they get very far in the school year. And your research had some pretty surprising statistics about friendship endings. Can you expand on that a little, and why so many teen friendships end, and which friends are likely, which kinds of friendships are most likely to survive?
Sure, sure. So some of my research focused on predictors of the occurrence and timing of adolescent friendship dissolution, which is essentially what predicts if and when a teen friendship ends. To look at this, we looked at a cohort of adolescents and their friendships from middle school into high school. And the results are staggering. You know, you mentioned this, but 3 out of 4 friendships dissolved within the first year, which is just a crazy number to imagine, right? 75% of friendships don't even last a full year. And then we found 9 out of 10 dissolve before they get to high school. So that's essentially within 2 to 3 years. And then overall, only 1% of friendships from 7th grade lasted through high school. So, I mean, this is part of why it's so special when friendships do last from middle school into high school and later on into life, because they are so rare. So it's interesting, right? That so few of them don't last. So why not? You know, that's a natural question. And, you know, we talked a little before about how friendships in adolescence are a time of exploration, right? And exploration has many benefits, but when you test boundaries, that comes with a risk. And what happens when opposites don't attract? There's a lot of pressure in adolescence to maintain these friendships. And that's because when you lose a friend in adolescence, it's probably someone who you go to school with. And think about how terrible that could be, having to be around someone who you used to be friends with every day. There's no avoiding them. You have this logistical nightmare of trying to avoid them. And so you want to maintain that friendship against all odds. Now, that puts a lot of stress on teenagers who already have hormones raging, right? So you have this like terrible combination of pressure that they feel because they're afraid of the consequences of a friendship failure. But that can ultimately lead to this vicious cycle where they force friendships that maybe aren't going to work out long term. So they get stressed out because it's so much effort to try and force it. And that just creates more conflict within the friendship. And eventually you have this rough dissolution, which is exactly what they were trying to avoid in the beginning. My research looked at some of the predictors of if and when friendships dissolve. And the results were pretty clear that it comes down to opposites. So we looked at individual characteristics. So sometimes people think, well, if one person is really this or that, then they're going to be difficult to be friends with. It turns out that's not the case. It's really not about the individual's characteristics. It's about the differences between the friends. So the relationship characteristics. And we found that differences in a few different areas, like the friends being of different sexes, or having differences in how much their peers like them, if they have different levels of physical aggression or academic performance, as well as some clinical aspects, like if they're different in terms of levels of depression or levels of anxiety, that this predicts that friendships will dissolve faster and to a greater frequency. Now, what's interesting is this isn't a matter of where the difference is on the spectrum. It's just a matter of the magnitude of difference. So as the differences get larger, you're going to have more frequent friendships dissolving. But if you have a small difference, even if you're both maybe highly anxious, that's okay. That is similarity. Or you could both be not anxious at all, and it'd be fine. So that was really interesting. That it has nothing to do with where on the spectrum you are, just how similar, how different you are to your friend. That will often determine when the friendship ends and if it does.
So are there any, did your study talk about what happens to teens and schools when these friendships end? What the sort of consequence of so many friendships ending? What's the consequence?
That's a good question, because with so many ending, there has to be some sort of consequence, right? And, losing a friend is hard. It's sad. And it doesn't matter when it happens, if you're a child, an adolescent, or a parent. But, everything feels much more intense when you're an adolescent. So it can feel a lot more stressful, a lot more chaotic when you lose an adolescent friend. So teens might go through some sort of grieving process where they're really trying to maybe not admit that it actually dissolved, but eventually they get to acceptance. And they might feel moments of loneliness. And this makes sense because friendships influence your identity. So it's natural for a loss of a friendship to cause someone to reevaluate their identity. But that sounds scary, right? It sounds really scary to be an adolescent teen. You lost a friend and now you have to reevaluate your identity. But that's not necessarily the case. It might mean that they realize that they were only playing a certain sport or engaging in a certain activity, or they weren't engaging in a certain activity because of that friendship. And so when that friendship dissolves now, there are opportunities, there are more open doors where they can either start or stop playing a sport or an activity because they genuinely have interest in it or not, as opposed to just doing it because you wanted to try out what your friend was doing, but that's not a great reason to do anything. And so it can be sad for sure, but it can also come with this upside of growth.
Mm-hmm. One of the things in my book that I tried to show is Francis and Sonia, when they meet, they're both creative. So they have that similarity and they want to be visible at their high school. So they decide they're going to create an alternative. They're kind of a little scornful of typical high school clubs and typical high school activities. And so they want to create a different kind of homecoming float so they can participate, but in their own way. So they get their homecoming class, which is English, to just they want to use Francis's dad's band bus, and they all write their favorite poems on the bus and create the world's first poetry mobile, which is the cover. If some of you have seen the cover, you may wonder, why is there a school bus with writing all over it? But that is the world's first poetry mobile. It was a huge hit at homecoming. And at that moment, they both felt they were braver and bigger and more visible together, which was really important for each of them in a big urban school to feel like they had a way of being seen. So even though they're very different personalities, it's exactly what you said. They share that creativity and that bond. So what can parents and schools and families do to support teen friendship?
That's a good question, right? Because we know it's going to happen. Does it need to happen this often, I guess is the question. And if we want to have more stable adolescent friendships, then everyone should be trying to focus on helping adolescents to identify others that are similar to them and others who they might have a stable relationship or friendship with over time. That looks different depending on whether you're a parent, a teacher, or a clinician. For clinicians, if you're already working with adolescents who are struggling with peer relations, then you might not be actually looking at the right thing. You don't want to look at the individual's characteristics. You want to understand, who are these people they're trying to befriend and how different are they from them? Are they the right people they should be trying to befriend? And help them to identify, okay, well, what about me do I like, and what do I want to see in a friend, and how can I bridge those similarities? As parents and teachers, it's a little bit different because when friendships end, they also often cause a little bit of drama, both at school and at home. And so parents and teachers need to be prepared for that. And for parents especially, it should be a load off to understand that it's totally common, totally normal for friendships in adolescence to come quickly and to be intense and then to dissolve just as fast. So you don't have to worry when your adolescent is sort of picking and choosing and pruning their friendships. That is very normal. It is part of the growth process. It's part of them forming their identity and understanding who they are, who they want to be. For teachers, it can be helpful actually to partner friends up in school during academic work, only if they're similar in academic performance. So that was something that we found out throughout a few different studies in research, where friends working together tend to perform better, but they have to be friends who are of similar performance. And if they're not, then you end up with this discrepancy where one person's doing all the work and the other one is having a nice relaxing holiday. So it's something to keep in mind as a teacher. You want to, if you're going to allow friends to work together, you also want to think about, well, are they really at the same academic competence or academic performance? Because you don't necessarily want to be the reason that they dissolve, but it could also cause problems in the classroom. And I mean, differences we've seen definitely predict dissolution, but they were specific differences, right? It wasn't across the board. Every single thing we looked at predicted dissolution. So we don't want to.
Disillusion meaning friendship endings.
Right, exactly. So it's not like any difference is going to be a problem for a friendship. There are specific types of differences that matter. And so we still want to celebrate differences. We still want to celebrate everybody's variety and variability. But we also want to be aware that if we want long-term friendships, it's probably safer to go with folks who are more similar to you. So either way, you can grow.
Yeah, well, I just want to bring in, as one of the studies I was reading as I was writing my book was, you may have seen this, at a school in England, there was a headmaster who wanted to ban best friends at his school because it was causing so much pain and drama in the school and creating so much trauma for the different groups, that he said, if I could, I would ban best friends and just have young people be in groups. So is there a natural, this is something we didn't really talk about, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Is there a natural inclination of teens to want to be in best friendships versus groups? And, or is that something that parents and grandparents can encourage? And do you think that is helpful to encourage groups over a best friend?
That's a good question. In schools, you're already in a group setting. And so you naturally have that developing where you have sort of clusters of friendships that are not really cliques per se, that has like a negative connotation, but just folks who are very similar. They do a lot of things together. They move through life together. That's great. It is good, though, to have at least one close friendship. Now, does it have to be a best friendship? There's a reason that he wants to ban best friendships, right? Because that is a label that you assign to a friendship, and that just increases the intensity of the friendship because of the nomenclature, because of labeling it. And so that just increases the stress, it increases the intensity. And then if it dissolves, it can be so painful. Whereas you wonder, like, well, if you didn't call it a best friendship, would it have been as painful? It could have had very similar characteristics, but you're removing one of those aspects that makes it more stressful, or feeling like, well, it can't fail. It's my best friend. And it also can be a little isolating, because how many best friends can you have? That's always a debate, right? How many favorites can you have? And I would argue, having a best friend, yeah, it's great, but personally, I'd rather have several good friends, several close friends. And then within a group, certainly that's nice because you get a little bit more of that variability. People have different perspectives, different opinions, different interests. And so you can have sort of your safety net of people who are very similar to you, but also folks you can turn to when you want to try something new, maybe try out a new hobby or a new sport and just see if you like it. And if you don't, you have the folks you're similar with. And if you do like it, then you've just grown your inner circle a bit more.
So one of the things I wanted to come back to, you said aggressiveness was one of the qualities that they needed to be similar in.
Mhm.
So would you call Sonia, the character, aggressive? Because she's very, or does that mean physical aggressiveness? And how does that show up?
That's a good question. So our research focused on physical aggression, but there's definitely more of that like relational aggression among females, right? So physical aggression is more common among boys, just generally. But relational aggression is relative to physical aggression, a lot more common among girls. And I think your excerpt, your reading pointed that out, right? The notion of passive aggressiveness, that is relational aggression at its heart. And so, even Sonia calling Frances passive aggressive is a passive aggressive or relational aggressive act, and she is very astute in the book. She has a lot of wit about her. And I would definitely characterize her as more passive aggressive and just generally more aggressive, even though she might not be physically so.
Mhm.
She definitely of the two has more of that tendency.
Well, given your research showing that certain kinds of similarities are create a better chance at lasting friendships. We're a much more diverse world. Schools are much more diverse. How do we bridge that different? How do we get young people to be friends with people who are not like them? Given that research that friendships are much more likely to last with similar types of friends.
That's a fair question. There's a few things we need to consider. As much as we may want adolescents to do what we tell them, it's not going to happen. So we tell them to be friends with similar folks. They're probably going to look for the person who's like the complete opposite of them. So we have that going for us, right? Because we want to have those moments where you can explore differences and challenge yourself. There's also this tendency in adolescence to befriend people who you just want to be like. So that often means they're different from you if they're someone you want to be like. And so it's natural for them to also explore differences in that way. So they might maybe think that they're like this person and then find out that they're not so. So I think in adolescence, like there's really no way around it. Teens are going to befriend people who are different from them, which is great. That is really where you can broaden your horizons. You can challenge your perspectives and step out of your comfort zone. And that's great. It's wonderful that that happens in adolescence. I think it's harder as teens get a little bit older. You do become more comfortable. You have your inner circle of folks who are really similar to you. And then it's a little bit more challenging to step out of your comfort zone and talk to people whose opinions differ from you, or whose perspectives are completely different. And that's where we need to put a little bit more focus, a little bit more time, flexibility, openness, because that's really what allows everyone to grow, both as an individual and as a friend.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't discuss this next question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How just your gut response. This is outside probably your research, but you must have a lot of insight into this. During the pandemic, I've heard so many people talk about how friendships have changed. And for many of us, we had to not see friends. We had to, would you say the same kinds of things that you learned about adolescent friendships are true for adult friendships? In terms of lasting and in terms of, so in other words, does this show up in adult friendships too? The number of friendships that end and the difficulty in sustaining friendships? Because you hear so much about loneliness now among adults, and people in their 20s and 30s more than ever are talking and writing about loneliness. So would you say this is also carrying through to young people who are no longer teens but are adults?
A lot of it certainly does translate. And I think the pandemic really highlighted the need for friendship and the need for that social interaction, because during the pandemic, a lot of people went from working in an office who, most people have friends in the office, right? Instead of becoming friends with people who are in your homeroom, you become friends with the people in the cubicle next to you. It's very natural. It's very easy. And when you take away that social interaction, that social proximity, it's very natural to start feeling a bit of isolation and loneliness, especially if you live alone. And so a lot of that does translate in terms of like how much differences impact adult friendships. I think the same concept applies quite a bit, but there's less pressure on adult friendships than there is for teen friendships. The reason being that adults get to control virtually every aspect of their life. They get to decide where they work, when they work, who they work for, what they do, what they eat, everything. And so it's not like that friendship is the one area of their life that they get to control. And so it doesn't feel as pressured to make it work. You have a lot less stress, which means the friendships in adulthood tend to be more truly voluntary, where you're only in friendship because you want to be. And that makes those friendships more meaningful over time.
Mm-hmm. In the book, Frances's mom plays a pretty big role in the friendship and guides her daughter and tells her at one point, what you and Sonia are going through is normal. You need to widen the container of the friendship as you each grow to embody your friendship. And I know in my life, I have sort of now learned over many years to take the long view of a friendship, that it needs a wide space to last for a whole lifetime. So I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about the book in terms of what we've talked about. And we have about 15 more minutes. I think I'm going to, if you're okay with it, Amy, I'm just going to read a short section at the very end where they are, where their differences and different ways of looking at the friendship really come into play. So is that okay with you, or do you
Yeah, of course.
Let me just find it. Okay. So Sonia and Frances break up, and Frances is really worried about Sonia because she's seen her really descend into a depression. And her mom says, why don't you reach out to her with a note? And she does. And Sonia doesn't answer. And then one day, Frances is coming back from soccer and she sees Sonia sitting on their bench. And they begin to talk. And she says, For a moment, it felt like old times, Sonia and me on our bench. It's like we've both been on long trips, I said, and now we have a lot to tell each other. That's when I looked at Sonia and saw tears running down her cheeks. She was hugging the outside of her arms. Sonia, what's wrong? She wiped her eyes and stared down at her lap. I feel so old, not in a good way. Her voice faltered. I feel like I've already lived everything and felt everything, and there's nothing left. I gently nudged her arm. Remember we're the poets? I wanted her to remember the poetry mobile and the fun we'd had at homecoming, how everything felt so big and connected because of who we were together. I wanted desperately to capture that feeling again, to share something easy. But Sonia refused to enter that moment with me. Maybe she couldn't, maybe she didn't want to. Why didn't you answer my note? I asked her. She shook her head slowly. Do you know what it's like to be best friends with someone who has the life you wish you had? I've always pictured coming home from college, dropping off my luggage, and then coming right over to your house. She glanced at me. Maybe I was wrong to consider your house home, but it's the closest I've ever come to feeling safe. Honestly, I don't understand why I can't stay with you this summer. Your brother and sister will be gone. Your house has so much space. I love your family. I followed all the rules while I was here. Why can't I stay with you? Her words hung in the air. I wondered how our friendship had become so complicated, how you entangle the knots inside closeness, the ones that were there before we even met. I felt her pain, but each time I thought about having her stay with us again, my heart raced. The same panicky feeling that came each time I felt her taking over my life. She breathed in deeply, exhaling her words. Maybe I just care more about you than you care about me. Sonia, that's not true. You're my best friend, I whispered. But to you, friendship means all or nothing. We're different. You're a 100% kind of person. I'm not. You can change. Sonia, this is who I am. It doesn't mean I should change. I think about things way too much, and I don't speak my feelings all the time. Sometimes, most of the time, I don't even know what I feel. And I need space to figure that out. That's hard when you're staying with us. Can't you understand that? I'm going to end there because that's Fran finding her own voice in the friendship. And that's really for me what this book is all about. It's each of them having an equal voice in their friendship. And so I think from here, we're going to open it up for questions and comments. I see only one. I'd love to get more questions and comments. Do you see from Carla? I grew up in a small remote town with a group of good friends, most still close. Could that culture help foster long-term friendships in that people know each other so well? Or are groups more stable?
That's a good question. So we haven't done research looking at like small towns versus larger towns and how the friendships compare in terms of like how many last until when. But small remote towns do tend to have quite a bonding nature to them. And anecdotally, I would say, yes, those friendships do tend to last longer, at least for the folks who stay in town. When you start having folks leaving and traveling or moving to other towns, bigger cities, or just further away, then you really are disrupting that. And then you're dealing with a very different phenomenon. But for the folks who stay in the town, I would say, yes, generally, you're going to have that bond from such a young age. And you also have fewer options for friendships. And so, you're friends with people based off of who's around. So typically if you have fewer options, you're going to stick with them a little bit longer. Now with social media, that is a game changer, right? Because you can befriend people who are on the opposite side of the world. So that would be an interesting area to look at, what role does social media play? And you could do that, right? You could look at friendships from folks a generation ago compared to now and see how that's changed.
And just from a gut level, I will say that I think teens in urban environments, for instance, Francis and Sonia are both at Southwest, which is a huge high school, urban high school. And I think part of what bonds them is they want to be visible. And you once said to me, Amy, it provides social protection. Friendship operates as social protection in schools. And I think for Sonia and Fran to have that sense of belonging to somebody and home away from home is so important, which is partly why Francis doesn't want to see any negatives in the friendship when it first begins. From Carrie, please send your questions. From Carrie, how would you help a teenager who's struggling to form friendships?
Good question. So teens who struggle to form friendships, I mean, that can be for a number of reasons. And I would start with focusing on what does that teen want out of the friendship? Is the teen looking like Sonia and Francis for sort of that social insulation, that protection, or are they looking for something else? And that will drive who you try to befriend. A great way to form friendships is to focus on what you like doing. So that often means allowing teens to pick the groups or the sports or the activities that they want to do and really letting them pick. Again, teens have very little control over their lives. We don't think about that very often, but they really don't have a lot of freedom. And so giving them areas where they can have freedom and letting them pick which sports they want to do or which activities, events they want to get engaged in can be a great way for them to form friendships. And it's important to be very flexible with that because they might think they want to do X, Y, Z, and then the next week do it and realize, oh, no, I don't. So as a parent, you have to be very flexible and go with the flow. If they want to try out a different sport, support it, allow them to get exposed to it and meet the people they would meet, other teammates or classmates, whoever's in the sport or group. And that's where they're going to form friendships. It naturally has that similarity built in because everybody's there for the same reason. And so it can make it a little bit easier to form new friendships.
And from Margie Dines, what do you think the difference is between adolescent boys and girls in their friendship?
Good question. They're very different.
Different. Just my personal experience is that, can I just throw out what I would think?
Please.
I would think girls get much closer, want to get closer, want to share much more. And I would say boys are more activity oriented. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So boys tend to be more focused on like physical engagement, like activities, sports, events, things like that. Whereas teen girls tend to be more interested in like that social, emotional engagement. They might play sports too, but they're also talking while they're playing sports.
So from Ona Gritz, I find it interesting that social media gives us a new way to stay connected to people further away and to reconnect with old friends. Have there been studies about this that how social media has shifted things?
That's a good question. I know there are studies on social media and how it changes engagement, specifically about how it has changed the landscape in terms of connecting with former friends or old friends. I'm not sure if there's anything on that, but it's definitely something to look into. And I would say, again, especially with the pandemic, I've heard so many stories from people about like having time at home. And so they thought about a friend and they haven't talked to them in 20 years. So they decided to Google them and find them on LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever, and reconnect. And that's not something that would have happened 10, 15 years ago. So definitely there will be more research coming in that direction, because now it's such a, commonplace activity within life. Like you can't really escape social media. So I'm sure it's going to become a much more popular area of study.
The next question, ironically, is from Deborah Morse, who is one of those friends I connected with during the pandemic. And she introduced me to my husband 40 years ago. So it's been really great to reconnect. She asked, there seems to be at least an unconscious homoerotic element in the friendship of these two girls. How did you represent this in the book? Well, first of all, they are very focused on boys. So I do think girls get friend crushes. They find a friend who they get a crush on, but it may not be sexually, that it's a sexual crush. It may just be that they feel an intense longing to be like that friend or to spend time with that friend. I do think that, well, that's a good question. I don't know. Amy, you read the book. What do you think about that?
So that didn't really come across to me. To me, it just felt like teen girls who are now exploring boys a little bit more. And so to me, I think I just ascribed all of it to like the hormone changes that are happening, where everything has some appeal. But I would tend to agree, like there's certainly such a thing as having like a girl crush, where you really like your friend, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in a romantic way.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, well, anybody? Okay, I have a question for Amy. How did you decide to study teen research? To research teen friendship? How did you decide to go into that field?
So I really like the fact that it's one area in adolescence that teens get to control. And you have sort of this perfect storm of raging hormones and lack of control, but a tiny bit of freedom with friendships, where it's like this microcosm where you get a lot of action when it comes to like social emotional development. And it's sort of like a concentrated version of that. So, you can study it in adulthood, but it might take a lot longer to understand the social emotional impacts. Whereas if you look at teens, you're going to get that within a year. And that's so true. If you think about when you're an adolescent and think about just 1 year of being a teenager and everything that happened in that year, there's a lot of action in that. There's a lot of drama. And psychological research does tend to gravitate towards the drama, right? That's where we are interested. We're trying to understand the human condition, trying to understand what causes what and when. And so using teens or adolescents as like the platform allows you to get a lot of information, a lot of data quite quickly. And there's a lot of changes going on during adolescence. So it's this treasure trove of insight into the human condition. And it's just a really interesting time.
I used to teach poetry and fiction to teens, and it was so intense. You just walk into the room and you could just feel it. So I totally get that. It is a very fertile ground for studying, and a fertile ground for a YA novel. I really want to thank everybody for being here tonight, family, friends, writers. And I certainly learned something from Amy. I hope you did too. And this will be available if they're recording it. So if you want to hear more or share it with a teen, please know that it will be available. And Amy, so grateful you were willing to join us tonight. You have an expertise very few people have. So thank you, and hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate you including me on this.
Oh, it was fun. Okay. I don't know how to turn us off though. So there we go.